Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Book 4 of Aristotle's Politics. So this is another book that covers a lot of ground. Aristotle's laying out a lot of important ideas and principles here in much the same way he does, for instance, in Book 3. So he starts early in Book 4, and he gives us the goals for this book. He says, first, we must determine, first, how many varieties of the constitutions there are, if indeed there are several kinds of democracy and oligarchy. Next, 2, which kind is most attainable and which most choice-worthy after the best constitution. Skip a little bit. After these things, 3, how someone who wishes to do so should establish these constitutions. I mean, each kind of democracy or oligarchy. And then skip a little bit. 4, we must try and go through the ways in which constitutions are destroyed and those in which they are preserved, both in general and in the case of each one separately. So this is the set of things Aristotle is proposing to do in Book 4. What are the different types of democratic and oligarchic constitutions? Which ones are the best? How can they be created, and how might they be destroyed? So it's an ambitious book. But he starts with a sort of fundamental principle applicable to this question, which is why different types of constitutions exist. And essentially, because Aristotle argues that a constitution is the organization of offices within a particular body politic, different city-states, different policies are necessarily going to organize things in different ways. Therefore, there are going to be different constitutions. So this is essentially what he says here. But he says basically there are 2 fundamental types of constitutions, and all of the others are deviations from this. So those are democracy and oligarchy. It's a little bit confusing here because in Book 3, Aristotle had drawn a distinction between democracy and Politeia. So remember, democracy in Book 3 is when the poor rule for the benefit of the poor rather than for the benefit of everyone, whereas Politea is where everyone has a say in government for the benefit of everyone. In this book, Book 4, some of the times that Aristotle is talking about democracy, he seems to actually be talking about what he elsewhere calls Politeia, but then here in this book he will give us a slightly different definition of Politeia. So there's a little bit of sort of terminological confusion, and because I don't actually read Greek, I can't go back to the original Aristotelian texts and sort of parse whether he's using the same terms here and just using them inconsistently, or whether that's the translation by C.D.C. Reeve happens to try and gloss these terms and does it slightly confusingly. I don't have a good sense of that, unfortunately. But for instance, in chapter 4, Aristotle says here, it is a democracy when the free and the poor who are a majority have the authority to rule, and an oligarchy when the rich and well-born who are few do. So again, he's still fundamentally thinking about democracy as being the power of the poor more than the power of everybody. So we get that element of it. But then slightly later, when we're in chapter 5, he gives us five different kinds of democracy. 4.5 different kinds of democracy, kind of. I'll clarify that in just a little bit. But what he says for the first kind of democracy, the first democracy then is the one that is said to be most of all based on equality. For the law in this democracy says that there is equality when the poor enjoy no more superiority than the rich, and neither is in authority, but the two are similar. For if indeed freedom and equality are most of all present in a democracy, as some people suppose, this would be most true in the Constitution, in which everyone participates in the most similar way. But since the people are the majority and majority opinion has authority, this Constitution is necessarily a democracy. This then is one kind of democracy. Now this is really striking because elsewhere, Aristotle tends to define democracy as rule by the poor for the benefit of the poor. Even in the previous chapter, chapter 4 of this book, Aristotle had given us that definition, but now his first definition of a kind of democracy is really what he calls Politeia in book 3. It is everybody having an equal share in ruling, regardless of whether they are rich or poor. Now, that simply isn't a decisive factor in whether or not a citizen gets to engage in the life of the city-state. So that's really interesting, because here Politea becomes the highest form of democracy. So that's quite striking to me. Second, we have another form of democracy, is where offices are filled on the basis of property assessments, although these are low, and where anyone who acquires the requisite amount may participate, whereas anyone who loses it may not. So this is actually on the border of oligarchy in a way, because it is based on a wealth requirement. Just the wealth requirement, the threshold is set so low that the overwhelming majority of citizens can participate. Number 3, another kind of democracy is where all uncontested citizens participate and the law rules. So this is, again, seems closer almost to Politea than it does to what he elsewhere says democracy means, because everybody who's a full citizen is able to participate. The key distinction he makes here is that the law is supreme in a way that in the first version, it's not necessarily quite as clear whether the law is supreme or majority opinion can be supreme. Number 4, another kind of democracy is where everyone can participate in office merely by being a citizen and the law rules. So this is a little bit broader, again, because in number 3, you had uncontested citizens. So everybody who's a full citizen, an adult, whatever it is, whatever standards you would set up for not contesting someone's citizenship. With number 4, you would sort of go beyond that, open it up further. Anybody who's a citizen of any standing can participate. Great. Number 5 is on the border, because initially what Aristotle says of it is another kind of democracy is the same in other respects, but the multitude has authority, not the law. This arises when decrees have authority instead of laws, and this happens because of popular leaders. So essentially the 5th version of democracy that Aristotle explains here is demagoguery, basically. You have a popular leader who rises up, who gains authority through the support of a large portion of the population, and then they rule arbitrarily and personally, rather than having equality before the law based on consistent application of rights and privileges. Aristotle says this isn't really a form of democracy, even though it may look like democracy. We might think, for instance, about Adolf Hitler, who was elected chancellor. Like he gained that position, he gained leadership of Germany through democratic mechanisms, and then he used that authority to destroy those democratic mechanisms. And became a totalitarian ruler. This is the kind of demagogue that Aristotle is here saying looks like democracy, isn't democracy. So that's great. So that's actually chapter 4 of this book. Chapter 5 shifts to talking about the kinds of oligarchy. And remember, Aristotle basically defines oligarchy as rule by the wealthy on the premise of being wealthy and for the benefit of the wealthy. And he says that there are 4 kinds of oligarchy. One that has offices filled on the basis of such a high property assessment that the poor, even though they are the majority, do not participate, but anyone who does acquire the requisite amount may participate in the constitution. So this is the sort of free market model, I guess, where anybody who becomes wealthy can participate in politics just on the basis of being wealthy. That's the only real qualification. 2. In another, the offices are filled on the basis of a high assessment, and they themselves elect someone to fill any vacancy. If they elect from among all of these, it is held to be more aristocratic, if from some specified people, oligarchic. So this takes us into a combination of rule by the wealthy and sort of representative government. Number 3, in another kind of oligarchy, a son succeeds his father. So this would be a system more like a sort of aristocratic system where you have hereditary positions. And then 4, in a fourth, what was just mentioned occurred, but not the law, but the officials rule. This is to oligarchy what tyranny is to monarchy, and to democracy, and to the democracy we spoke of last among democracies, that being demagoguery. So you've got those different kinds of oligarchies. But as book 4 goes on, Aristotle comes to the question of what's the best type of constitution, or what's the best approach to building a constitution. And as he said in book 3, he comes down on the idea of Politeia as the most effective constitution. However, he gives us here a different understanding of Politeia. Essentially, Politeia is in book 4 a mixture of democracy and oligarchy. And he even says here, the defining principle of a good mixture of democracy and oligarchy is when it is possible to speak of the same constitution both as an oligarchy and as a democracy. So basically, he encourages combining elements from both a democratic constitution and an oligarchic constitution in order to create the maximum engagement of the widest number of citizens. Again, this seems a little bit inconsistent because he says the first type of democracy basically involves everybody. So it seems like that's already got it covered because the rich are already represented there. But he does suggest ultimately that the best constitution will give the poor representation, give the rich representation, and yet in some way, depending on what particular way it shakes out, the wealthy will be more responsible for the good of the city-state. More of a burden will be placed on them because they can more easily fulfill those obligations, etc., etc. This idea that the best constitution is a mixed constitution is kind of based on Aristotle's overall ethic that he develops across a number of his philosophical texts of the golden mean, that the thing that's in the middle tends to be the best. So that's basically the point of this idea of the middle constitution as the most effective one. Lastly, he kind of turns his attention to this question of what is it that governments actually are supposed to do, or that constitutions are actually supposed to do. And he identifies three major tasks or spheres of responsibility that a government will have. One is it deliberates about public affairs. Two is it concerns the offices, that is to say, which offices there should be with authority over what things and in what way officials should be chosen. And three is that it decides lawsuits. So this is essentially the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. I mean, the governments like the US government, the British government, the Canadian government have this basic kind of structure. And a lot of other contemporary liberal democracies do as well. We can see these things reflected. We can also see these things reflected in the ancient Athenian constitution, for instance. And the question then becomes, according to Aristotle, in terms of how you figure out what type of constitution to have, is how these things are decided. So how do whoever is allowed to deliberate about public affairs, how do they actually do that? And he says here, for all to deliberate about all issues is characteristic of a democracy, since this is the equality the people seek. But there are several ways of having all deliberate. And so again, this is the sort of question in terms of how you define a constitution is, how do you actually organize a government to do the things that a government is supposed to do? And the different choices that one could make, or that a city-state could make, about how to actually organize these things will determine what kind of constitution it has. One last thing I do want to say about Book 4, I found this a very, very striking thing. I am a critic of representative democracy. I'm not a fan of it, especially in the US, where we have substantial influence of money. But he does have this line here where he says, when not everyone participates in deliberation, but only those elected, and when, as before, they rule in accordance with law, it is oligarchic. So Aristotle says here, representative democracy in which people are chosen and they are the ones who are empowered to make political decisions is a form of oligarchy, not a form of democracy. Now, whether or not we're willing to accept that is very, very contentious. There are people today who would make that argument, that representative democracy is not, in fact, a form of democracy. I think, and I'm sympathetic to that argument, I think direct democracy is a better system. However, there is no contemporary nation state that runs through direct democracy. With a city-state with a limited franchise, the way that you had in the Athens of Aristotle's day, yeah, you can have direct democracy. In a nation-state the size of the United States and with the population of the United States, even a nation-state the size of, say, Luxembourg, very, very small nation, very, very small population. It would be incredibly difficult to have direct democracy in the way that you had direct democracy in ancient Athens. So, because the modern nation-state runs on a different economy of scale than the Greek city-states did, democracy almost by necessity needs to mean something else. That doesn't necessarily tell us that it needs to mean what contemporary liberal democracy does mean in practice. There are potentially other, maybe better systems. But Aristotle would probably say that the system we have now in the US, in the UK, in Canada, in many other liberal democracies is oligarchy, not democracy.